This is our sensory processing difficulties parent workshop. So I'm going to hand over to Vicki Robinson.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. So actually I can see the chat box as well, Charlotte. So if people have questions as we go through, then just feel free to type them in the chat box. And if it's relevant to what I'm saying at the moment, I'll just answer there and then while we're kind of in the moment of talking about it. If it's not, then I will come back to the questions at the end. Hope that's okay. So just before I introduce myself, just to let you kind of know how I'm going to run this workshop, if you like. So what I thought we would do is just run through some information about what is sensory processing disorder. I'm going to assume that people have a kind of very basic knowledge of sensory processing because everyone has different levels of knowledge, whether you've seen an occupational therapist before or you haven't. It all depends on that in terms of how much you're going to know about. So we're going to talk about what actually is sensory processing. I'm going to go into a bit of information about our different sensory systems, just so you get used to a bit of the terminology, and so you're hearing from me some of the words and some of the names that you may be reading about when you're Googling or looking on Pinterest or wherever you go to get ideas, because we all know we do it. And then I'm just going to share a really simple analogy that I use when I work with families, just to help explain how sensory processing works and how it can impact children. Okay? Then after that, we'll have an opportunity for some question and answers. So I hope that's okay for everyone. So before we kind of jump in with the information about sensory processing, let me just tell you who I am. So my name is Vicki Robinson and I am a children's occupational therapist. So I specialise in children with sensory processing difficulties, and I have done so for about 16 years now, so that always makes me feel old when I say how long I've been working for. So I work for the NHS part-time, and I also run a private online therapy services. So my online therapy service is specifically for families of children with sensory processing difficulties. Now, I know there was a couple of questions there about, is this for children with Down syndrome or ASD? From my point of view, diagnosis or not doesn't really matter. Obviously, it has an impact, and it does have various other factors that we need to consider. However, from a sensory processing point of view, we would address those sensory challenges exactly the same way with any child, any diagnosis, and also children who don't have a diagnosis as well, because we know that children who don't have diagnoses can also have sensory processing difficulties as well. So really what I'm talking about this evening is covering that huge kind of variety of different conditions and different diagnoses that we may see across the board. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. So I run an online therapy service, and as part of that, I deliver training to parents through online programs, and I also offer consultations on a one-to-one basis through Zoom calls as well, which have been really, really successful. So that's good to know. Right, so let's jump in now. You know a bit about me. So we'll start with what is sensory processing disorder. Now, sensory processing disorder is, or can be, this kind of big, complex thing that people kind of get a little bit scared of, but it's my job to try and simplify that for you all, to kind of give you an explanation that you can start to understand what your child's needs are and how it's impacting on your child. Because without that understanding, it then makes it really difficult to identify the appropriate strategies to implement for your child. So it's really important that you have this understanding, because, you know, we've all seen the lists of sensory activities that you can find on Google and all of these places. But the key to supporting your child's sensory needs is actually understanding your child's specific sensory needs. And it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, okay? So it's important that we delve deeper into your child's specific needs to identify the right sensory strategies to use at the right time, at the right place, and in the right way, all right? So sensory processing disorder is something that kind of gets mentioned, but actually sensory processing disorder is what I call an umbrella term for lots of different subtypes of sensory processing needs. So when someone says my child has sensory processing disorder, that could mean lots of different things. And this is one of the important things that we need to kind of identify and iron out before we can look at specific strategies. So under the umbrella term of sensory processing disorder, you have 3 subtypes. One of those subtypes is sensory modulation disorder. One of them is sensory discrimination disorder, and one of them is around postural and movement difficulties. So that's more your DCD, developmental coordination disorder, and dyspraxia, and postural difficulties that children have. So what I'm going to focus on this evening is that sensory modulation disorder, because that is generally the group of parents and the group of children who often struggle to access occupational therapy services because it doesn't fall within a physical kind of difficulty that your dyspraxia and your developmental coordination disorder would. So quite often mainstream OT services have a really good service for those children. So sensory modulation disorder, and don't worry too much about remembering all of these names and the terms. This is just to give you an overview this evening, just so that you've got a kind of an idea of the different types of SPD. So within sensory modulation disorder, you also have another 3 subtypes. So those 3 subtypes are children who are oversensitive to sensory information. So this might be children who struggle with tolerating clothes on their skin. So getting dressed is really difficult for them. Things like brushing their teeth or washing their hair, having their hair cut, or things like they're very picky eaters, for example. So that's when children are oversensitive, and that can be in one sense, in one sensory system, or in many sensory systems. The second subtype is children who are under-responsive. So this basically means that children don't really take in sensory information very well. So a lot of the information kind of isn't absorbed, it kind of isn't registered and goes over the top of their head almost. So these are children who tend to leave clothes twisted on their body, and they don't really notice if their hands or their face are messy. And these children often can be quite quiet, passive, and it's almost like kind of the world's passing them by, okay? So they don't really engage in play, in terms of group play. They much prefer just to play on their own, by themselves, quite sedentary. And the third subtype is children who are sensory seeking. So these are children who aren't registering sensory information very well. But in these children, what they do is they actually do something about it. They are actively seeking out and craving the sensory input that their body needs. Now, this could be children who are mouthing things, biting things, putting lots of non-food objects in their mouth. It could be children who are making lots of noise, touching everything, touching lots of objects and people. So it's that sensory seeking behaviour, your kind of crashes and your bangers and your fidgets, okay? So we've got those 3 different subtypes. Now you're probably already forming a picture in your mind as to maybe what kind of subtype your child might fit into. What often happens is at this point, parents get a little bit confused because they might think, right, well, I've got a sensory seeker in one sensory system. Maybe you've got a little fidget bot and they're constantly on the go. And you may have a child, so it's sensory seeking in one sense, but maybe sensory sensitive in another sense. So they may be really picky eaters, for example. And that's completely normal, that's common. Unfortunately, you know, for us, for me as a therapist, these children don't fit into one nice, neat little box. That would make my job a lot easier. But often they have little bits in different boxes. And this is going back to what I said earlier about why it's super important to have a good understanding of your child's sensory needs. Because if you just download a list of sensory activities from the internet, they aren't going to be specific to what your child's sensory needs are. So what's likely to happen is you'll try some of these activities, they won't work, you'll become disheartened and you'll give up. Okay, so this is why it's important to have the right strategies with the support to implement them as well. So that is kind of a whistle-stop tour through this huge thing that is sensory processing disorder. Now within our sensory processing system, we actually have 8 senses, and that surprises quite a lot of people, okay? So we all have, you know, we all know about the 5 senses that we learn about when we're at school. So we have sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And we're all aware of those 5 senses. Now those senses are what we call external senses. So that's because sensory information within those senses, that is imposed upon us from our environment. So we see things, we hear things, we smell things, we taste things, and we touch things that are external to our body. Now we also have 3 other sensory systems, and these sensory systems are internal to our body, okay? I'm just going to ask if everyone could just mute their microphones. I don't know if everyone can see the chat box, but I think not everyone's got their microphone muted. So so we also have 3 internal sensory systems as well, okay? And I'm going to give you a bit more information about those because these are probably going to be terms that you may or may not have heard of before. So the first internal sensory system is called proprioception. Now again, don't worry about these long words, okay? This is something that you can go away and have a look at another time. But I just want to give you a bit of information about them because they're super important when it comes to sensory processing. So proprioception, this in very basic terms is our body awareness, okay? So within our body we have lots of muscles and lots of joints. And within those muscles and joints we have receptors. When we move our body, those receptors are stimulated. And that very simply sends messages to our brain about where our body is and how our body is moving. And that is proprioception in a very simple way, okay? So this is what helps with things like coordination, spatial awareness, controlling how much force we use when we're moving our body. Okay, so it has a really massive effect, a massive impact on our child's day-to-day function. The second internal sensory system is called vestibular. Now, vestibular is responsible for our movement and balance. Okay, so our vestibular system is located really deep down in our inner ear. And whenever we move our body, the vestibular system is activated. Doreen said, is that like driving a car and not having to look at the foot pedal to know where your right pedals are? Absolutely. That's absolutely right, Doreen. Yeah. So yes, it's that body awareness and kind of knowing what your body parts are doing. So it's also super important for children when they're getting dressed and when they're wiping their bum, for example, when they've been to the toilet. When their hands disappear behind their back, they need to know where they are subconsciously in order to coordinate their hands to perform that action. So that is your proprioceptive system in action. So vestibular is located really deep down in our inner ear, and it's our movement and balance center. And this is really important for our balance, our coordination, to be able to sit still, to be able to move. So that again has a massive impact on our child's sensory processing abilities. The third internal sensory system is called Intraoception. Now, you may not have heard of this term because it's one of the newest sensory systems that's been identified, and we're starting to have a really big body of evidence to show that this sensory system has a massive impact on our children. So when we talk about interoception, what we're talking about is all of the receptors on our organs inside our body. So for example, we have receptors on our bladder and our bowels to let us know when we need to use the bathroom. We have receptors in our tummy to let us know when we're feeling full or when we're feeling hungry. So a lot of children who are struggling with sensory processing often have difficulties with their appetite, with eating, with toileting, toilet training, and we can track this back to lots of different sensory systems. But now we're having this increased knowledge of interoception. We've also got this area of sensory processing that we can tap into to support children as well. So those are our 8 sensory systems. Now, what I'm going to share with you is this analogy that I use with parents to try to explain to you how sensory processing works. So I use this analogy of sensory cups. So if you imagine that you've got your 8 sensory systems, and each of those sensory systems has a cup, okay? Now, what the aim is for your child to have full cups, 8 full cups. If we have 8 full cups, then that means that our sensory processing is working well and we are well regulated. Now, when I say well regulated, what I mean is that we are able to manage our emotions appropriately to our age, because that all depends on our age as well. It means that we can concentrate, focus when we're at school. It means we can play. It means that we can tolerate transitions and coping with moving from one activity to another, for example. It means that we can sit and eat a meal without getting distressed by certain smells or tastes or textures. So it has this massive knock-on effect on everything that we do day to day. Now, some children have very, very small cups for some senses. It's almost like a shot glass, okay? So if you imagine that one of the senses in your child's body has a super small shot glass. Now, what that means is that it only takes a little bit of sensory input to fill that cup. And then what's going to happen is it's going to overspill, overflow, and your child is going to become overstimulated. And those are the children who are oversensitive. So if you remember when I talked about sensory modulation and you had the 3 subsections, the oversensitive children have small cups, okay? On the flip side, you can have children who have large cups, so like a pint glass. And then this is where the other 2 subtypes fall into. So if a child has a big pint glass, so they've only got a little bit, they're not registering a lot of sensory information because their pint glass is so big, they've got a little bit of sensory input at the bottom, but they're not really registering it. They're not really taking it on board. They're not getting enough to be able to act upon it and use it appropriately. So these children are the kind of passive children that I mentioned earlier. Now, children who are sensory seeking, they are also children that have this big pint glass. But what's happening in those children is that they're actively trying to fill that pint glass. So they are craving and seeking as much sensory information as they can in order to fill that pint glass to get that cup full. All right. So even though I said we've got 8 sensors with 8 cups, what that can look like in reality is some small cups and some big cups, a small cup and a big cup, or you may have one small cup and lots of big cups. It can be different for each different sense. So again, this is why it's important to understand which senses your child is struggling with, and then whether they have a small cup or a large cup within those sensory systems, so we know what strategies and what tools to use to actually address your child's specific needs. So I hope that's making sense. I'm going to have a little look through the comments here and see whether people were, because there's a few comments popped up. So we've got, yes, my daughter has issues with interoception, difficulties doing everyday things, including being referred to OT for dressing, and she's 10. Yeah. Could be realising when they are too hot or cold. So going outside cold without a jacket, or keeping their school jumper on when the day is hot. Yeah, that's another great example for interoception. So Fern saying she doesn't know when she gets hot, and she'll keep her jumper on or dress in winter clothes when it's warm. Yeah, the temperature regulation is a big one for interoception. And there's a lot of education with children around that and kind of registering that interoceptive awareness and then being able to act upon it appropriately as well. So Christina's saying that Theo's got a mixture of what is being said. Yeah, so this is totally normal. So it's really, really rare for children to kind of fit into one nice, neat box. Often they have different elements of sensory processing, and this is why it's super important to have that professional support in order to work out what's going on for your child. So that was kind of the overview that I wanted to give you of sensory processing. So if anybody's got any specific questions about sensory processing, please do pop them into the chat box and I can answer as many questions as I can within the time that we've got. Just kind of a disclaimer before we start that it is really difficult for me to give very specific advice and strategies because, like I say, I don't know enough about your child in order to give you specific strategies. But what I can do is just point you in the right direction and give you things to think about. Quite often when parents ask me questions in Q&As, I tend to come back to you with about 3 or 4 other questions that you need to go away and consider, because that is my job as a therapist, is to make you delve deeper into things and really look at the bigger picture before we can fine tune and hone in on the exact things that we need to be working on. Mm-hmm. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to see if there's any questions that people have.
Thank you, Vicky. That's really great. I do have a question here from a parent who wasn't able to make the session, and it was around weighted blankets. Mm-hmm. Now, several people have suggested this to her as a potential strategy, resource to try. But because her child hasn't been assessed by an OT recently, she is worried that it could be harmful. Is there any circumstance where using a weighted blanket might not be advisable?
So I would definitely not recommend a weighted blanket for a child who has very limited mobility. So a child who has significant physical disabilities as well. Mm-hmm. So there has been incidences in the past where weighted blankets have been used with children, very limited situations I have to say, where they've been used with children who have little to no ability to move themselves. They're completely reliant on adults to move them into different positions. And there has been instances of fatalities where children have had, the blanket on top of them over their face, and they've been left for prolonged periods of time. So I would, if you have a child with, significant physical needs, I would 100% hold off and not do anything until you've spoken to a professional.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they probably just wouldn't recommend it, full stop.
Yeah.
In terms of kind of a child who is independently mobile and is able to move, weighted blankets are an option. However, they are expensive. And one of the things that I always say with the families that I work with is, let's try some free strategies first. There's lots of other things that we can try before that. So when we think about what a weighted blanket is providing, it's providing some proprioceptive input. So it's going back to that internal body sense that I mentioned earlier. And there's lots of different ways that you can give your child proprioceptive input before bedtime in order to give them that sensory input without having to use a weighted blanket. Other things that you could try is, a strategy that works really well for parents is so if you have your child in a single bed, for example, buying a, say, 3/4 or a double-sized duvet instead of a single duvet. So what you can do is you've got enough material to tuck it under the mattress at both sides. So what you're doing is giving your child some compression over their whole body by tucking it in tightly under the mattress, and that is providing some proprioceptive input. You could also try just popping a blanket or a throw, more so in the winter months, over the top of the blanket, the duvet, again, just to kind of give a little bit of extra weight. So that's something that you could try.
Thanks. That's great.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Christina here about smearing. What can I do to help with smearing poop, running in circles before bed, etc.? So many things. Okay, so there's two things there. Smearing, that's a really tricky one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So, there's various different things that you can try. One of the simple strategies that seems to work really well is, depending on the age of your child, Christina, obviously I don't know details, but if they are still young enough to fit into them, you can actually get bigger sized baby grows. I'm calling them baby grows, but you know what I mean. From Marks and Spencer's, they have a specialist range of specialist clothing. And what you can do is you could, depending on your child's fine motor skills, if they can still get into a baby grow and still get into their nappy and into their underpants, then what you can do is actually put it on backwards. So you've got the poppers at the back. And then that is just kind of, it gives you that bit extra time. Sometimes they're just in there super quick and you can't get there quick enough to stop them. But by having the poppers at the back, it can just give you that bit extra time to kind of get in there and stop it happening before it happens. So that's kind of something that you can use, a strategy you can use. But from a sensory processing point of view, what we would need to do is identify kind of what your child might be getting from doing that activity. So is it that they are sensory seeking in terms of how the poo feels on their hands? What are they doing with it when it's in their hands? Is it that they're sensory seeking smell? Is it that they're needing some extra stimulation and then know that they're getting kind of intense smell input by smearing? So it's looking at what they're trying to get from the activity and then give them that sensory input that they're trying to get, but obviously in a more appropriate way. So if, for example, this child was sensory seeking for touch, for example, we would want to be incorporating lots and lots of opportunities for tactile play throughout the day. So we want to be filling up that big pint glass for their tactile system so that they're not having to seek it out in lots of other different ways. Now, obviously, there could be loads of other elements going on for this child. That, it could be, issues around developmental age, cognition, understanding. So there's lots of things that you would need to consider as part of the bigger picture. I'm purely just giving you information here from the sensory side of things. And in terms of running around in circles before bed, again, we would need to kind of break that behaviour down and think what sensory systems are involved here. Again, kind of the obvious one from what you've said there is vestibular, because that's our movement sense. So it may be that your child has a large pint glass for vestibular input. So again, we need to be building in opportunities to provide your child with that movement that they are craving in the lead up to bedtime. So as part of your bedtime routine, what I would do is I would sit down with you and we would look at your bedtime routine, and we would look at how we can introduce some very specific sensory activities into the lead up to bedtime in order to fill that pint glass so that your child is more regulated when it comes to actually going to bed. So that is what we would do for those two questions.
Great. We've got another one here. What do you suggest to help with grinding teeth all the time?
Yeah, grinding teeth is a really common one. So teeth grinding can be for various different reasons. So I know I sound like a broken record here, but I can only kind of give you like a surface view here because I don't know all of the details. When we look at teeth grinding, again, thinking about what sensory systems might be involved, the obvious one, it's obvious to me, is that it may be proprioception, okay? So your child is seeking out some proprioception. Now, the reason that I say that is because when we grind our teeth, we're getting really intense, heavy work to the muscles and the joints around our jaw. So your child is getting proprioceptive input through grinding their teeth. Now, the reason why they are potentially seeking out proprioceptive input can be different for every child. And this is where we would need to look at the bigger picture and think about why are they doing it. So as an example, they may be teeth grinding because they are seeking proprioceptive input to help calm themselves. So it actually might be nothing to do with their mouth. It might be that they are oversensitive to something else in their environment that they can't control. So they might have realised that by teeth grinding, they can get some proprioceptive input and calm their sensory systems to help regulate. Because the mouth is like a super fast way of getting sensory input because there's so many nerve endings in and around your mouth. So often children go to their mouth to help to dampen down their sensitivity in another area because it's a quick fix for them. So that might be one example of why your child is teeth grinding. So in terms of what we can do about it, some people, what we want to do is give them proprioceptive input in a more appropriate way. So once we know what they might be overly sensitive to in other senses, then we can target those senses as a separate thing. But in terms of their mouth, if that's where they want to get their sensory input from, we can use things, like the chewy toys and all of those sorts of things. Although my view is that really we want to address the underlying issue. We don't just want to be giving a piece of jewellery or anything like that because, they get lost, they get dirty, they need cleaning, and often children will chew them for a couple of days and then they're just lost and forgotten about. So for me, I want to be addressing the actual underlying root cause. So if they are seeking proprioception, then we need to be giving them that in different ways. So it could be an electric toothbrush in their mouth and allowing them to have a play with an electric toothbrush because the vibration is a form of proprioception. Now, what I would imagine for this child, and what I would, again, I said I'll probably be batting questions back, I would imagine, Lydia, that your child has potentially got some wider issues in terms of their proprioceptive needs and possibly their tactile, their touch processing as well, because they're so closely linked. In which case we would have to look at the bigger picture, and I would be giving you specific strategies to target those throughout the day to help fill cups that need filling and empty cups that need emptying.
Thanks, that's great. Doreen says, my daughter has a wobble cushion at school but doesn't use one at home. Why would this be? She is movement seeking. Could it be to do with her anxiety level, or what do you think?
So she's got a wobble cushion at school, but she doesn't use one at home. Is that because she doesn't want to use one at home, or that she hasn't got a one at home?
It sounds like she doesn't want to use it at home, or she doesn't feel the need to.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't want to use it, yeah.
Right, okay. So, I mean, it all depends on the child why they don't want to use it. It may be that she just associates it with school, for example. But there's lots of different ways that you can get movement sensations in rather than just relying on a cushion, for example. So again, you know, children who are movement seeking have a big, large pint glass for it's likely to be their vestibular and their proprioceptive cups. So what we would want to do is be giving lots of opportunity for movement throughout the day, certainly when she gets home from school, because when you're at school, yes, she's got her wobble cushion to sit on, but depending on how old she is, she's going to be spending, you know, periods of time sitting still and expecting to sit and focus and concentrate. And that is really tiring, especially for our movement sensory seekers. So when she comes home from school, I would be having a sensory plan in place where we are giving her lots of intense movement to help fill those cups in order to rebalance out her sensory cups. And it may be that if we get those cups more balanced, then she doesn't need to use a wobble cushion at home, which would be absolutely fine. Mm-hmm. So we would be looking at movement activities. Have a little dance around your living room when you get home from school. Go to the park on your way home and get some play on the swings and on the slides and climbing frames. You know, getting lots of movement into your body would be really helpful.
Thank you, that's great. So Christina has a question. Why does my son hold both his ears and squeal when watching certain things on TV that he used to be okay with before?
So, I mean, again, it could be for various reasons. Obviously, I'm looking at it with my sensory hat on, but you need to consider your child and what their specific needs are. So you need to be considering any behavioural elements, any developmental considerations, all of those things as well. From a sensory point of view, what we could suggest is that there may be some sensitivity with noise. So it may be that he has some sensitivities to certain pitches or tones of sound. So when we think about sensitivity to sound, people often think that it's the volume of sound. So, you know, they just say, well, he's fine with loud noises, but it might not be the volume of sounds. It may be different pitches and tones. So I would say start with recording that and seeing if there's any pattern of certain things that he's seems to be maybe getting possibly oversensitive to, you know, certain tones or different adverts and things like that on the telly, and seeing whether you can see any pattern emerging. But again, it may just be a lot of children do this when they're excited as well. So it might be a way of him expressing himself. So, you know, again, I don't know whether he is verbal or non-verbal. So it's all of those things that need to be taken into consideration as well.
Great. Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any more questions? Let's have a look here. Somebody said, Orleen, I can't send my messages. I don't know why that would be. Because I know it is switched on. So that's tricky. Oh, hello.
Yeah, I can't send in the messaging. It's not letting me.
Oh, do you want to just ask a question?
Yeah, and my nephew, he keep chewing, obviously, his clothes and playing with his food a lot. So I had to actually spoon feed him now because all his food just gone over the hole and he's crushing it and squeezing it a lot
Mhm. Okay.
and just chewing everything.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, there's different kind of, so there's two different issues there. So there's chewing everything and there's struggling with the eating. So the eating side of things would need to be explored more to see whether that's a sensory issue or whether it may be a physical coordination issue. So is it that he is struggling to get the cutlery from the plate into his mouth in a coordinated way? So we would want to be considering, what his fine motor skills are like, what his coordination is like, and how he is able to manipulate the cutlery and things like that. So that may possibly be more of like a physical issue, but obviously I would need to kind of delve into it deeper to see if there was anything else going on sensory-wise.
Yeah, but when he's got the food in his mouth, he squash it with his fingers and squeeze it up a lot.
Okay, so he's playing with the food with his hands.
Yeah, squeezing it up, taking it out and squeeze it and put it back in his mouth. Yeah, like that.
Okay. So it may be that he is doing lots of sensory seeking within his tactile, his touch sense. So again, you want to be offering lots of opportunities for messy play throughout the day. So you want to be filling his sensory cup with lots of messy play opportunities, lots of tactile play opportunities. So particularly I would be doing that before meal times. So you've filled his cup, ready for him to then sit and be more well regulated before meal times. So that's what I would initially try. But like I say, I can't kind of give you specific things. In terms of the chewing of clothes, very similar to what I said earlier about the teeth grinding. So when we're chewing with clothes, again, we are kind of getting lots of tactile and lots of proprioceptive input in and around their mouths. So again, we want to be saying, we could be saying to them, we don't chew our clothes, but you have to be replacing that with something else that's giving them the same sensory input that they're seeking. So you're going to want to be looking at how can we get some proprioceptive input around their mouth. So you could, again, like I mentioned about the teeth grinding, you could try vibration, so an electric toothbrush, and you could use that regularly throughout the day, just let them play with it around their mouth. There's certain desensitization techniques that we can use in and around the mouth to give them lots and lots of sensory input. And I would take a guess that there's probably some wider issues in terms of his touch processing that need to be considered as a whole. And once you look at those, then you'll see an overflow into the eating and the chewing, and you'll see that some of those are reducing down.
Okay, so is it sensory when he's eating? Because before he never used to do this, because I think it just get worse. When he's eating now, he doesn't sit still. He's just running around and coming back and running, singing, making up loads of noises. He never used to do that, but it's just like these things that I've seen is getting worse now. I'm not sure why is this happening, but it's really bad.
Yeah, so again, thinking about what senses might be involved, it might be that he has a large cup for movement, so around either proprioception or vestibular or maybe both. So again, you want to fill those sensory cups. So we would need to be looking at specific activities that he can do regularly throughout the day in order to fill those sensory cups and keep him regulated. The wobble cushion that one of the other ladies mentioned earlier, that would be something that you could try at mealtime. So when you sit on a wobble cushion, it gives you a bit of movement in your chair. So that can just dampen down some of that excessive movement that he may be seeking and just enable him to sit in his chair for a bit of a longer time in order to be able to eat his meals.
So where do you get a wobble cushion from? Where do you recommend it?
If you just go online and just Google, I would Google move and sit cushion, and because the move and sit cushion is a wedge shape, and so it's really great in terms of keeping them in the right posture as well. And it's just a cushion that's half filled with air, So when it arrives, it's already half inflated, which you just leave it as it is. And then when you sit on it, it just gives you a wobble in your chair.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thank you.
No problem.
I'm muted. We've got a couple more questions here. So Fern has asked, what can I do to stop my daughter digging me in bed when she's going to sleep, and when she sleeps, she pushes her legs and feet really hard into me and through my legs, and her hands and arms into my armpits and under my back.
Sound like CJ. Same thing.
Uh-huh.
So this is when she's actually, also it's when she's going to sleep and when she sleeps. So, I mean, again, you know, I don't know the full picture, so I'm just reading between the lines of things that you're saying. But when we're pushing, and it sounds as though that she may have a large cup around her proprioceptive sense. So she's kind of she's trying to get some proprioceptive input by pushing against you, with her arms and her legs and her hands. So again, you would be wanting to look at your bedtime routine and start to incorporate some specific proprioceptive activities that's going to be filling that sensory cup for her in order to get her to be more well regulated before she goes to bed. And you might want to try things like that big duvet that we talked about earlier as an alternative to a weighted blanket, just to give her some compression during the night, which will be giving her some extra proprioceptive input as well.
Okay.
Excellent, thanks. We've got a question from Rachel. My son complains of feeling itchy and wiggles his body and jumps. What can I do to help? And then she said itching isn't just under his clothes, often arms, neck, head and bum.
Okay. So complains of feeling itchy and wiggles his body and jumps. I mean, I don't know. I can't give you a specific answer, but the first thing that popped into my head is around tactile processing. So maybe there is some sensitivity there. Now, I know you're saying it's not just under clothes, but yeah, I would want to be exploring his tactile sensory system in more detail. So I would want to be looking at when it's happening, how he's responding to it. What is he saying? So have you asked him what it is? I would be, depending on his age and his abilities and his speech and language, I would be asking him what he is experiencing as well. If it is, which I can't say for sure if it is, but if it is around some sensitivity to touch, then we would want to have some desensitization type of activities in place. So to help dampen down the sensitivity to his touch sensations. So when children are super sensitive to touch, it can even just be the feel of, wind on their skin. It may be that it's a bit of thread that's irritating their skin. It could be brushing past people, brushing past furniture. There's so many different things that can trigger that response within the tactile system that you or I, because we have typical sensory processing, might not even realise. So we would need to be looking into that in a lot more detail and seeing kind of exactly what's going on, and then we could look at some specific strategies to help.
Thank you. Does anyone have any further questions before we finish? So Doreen says, thank you, the workshop was great. Evaluation, I think exploring some strategies for us to use, understanding what is developmental or age appropriate behaviour, and some signposting to other help or strategies would be useful. Yeah. So hopefully we're in the process of recruiting an OT right now, but because they're so scarce, it is very tricky. We've had some difficulty, but we are hoping to run future sensory workshops and things. So this was just sort of a little bit of a taster for you to start thinking about. I know we had one scheduled for earlier in the year actually about sensory circuits, and that unfortunately had to be cancelled because of COVID and everything. It was scheduled for early April, I think. But we will try to look into rebooking that because there was quite a lot of interest in that. So yes.
Can I just let everyone know about, so if people are interested in delving a little bit deeper, I was just telling Charlotte earlier that next week I'm actually running a free sensory solutions workshop. So it's a 5-day workshop. So feel free. I did send Charlotte over the link. So
Yes.
if Charlotte will post that into the comments, which would be great. So if anyone wants to join me, you can just click on that link and just follow the instructions and it'll take you through to the workshop. It's actually starting tomorrow, so you can just get in there before it starts. And it's a 5-day workshop, which is basically running in a private Facebook group. So it's a 5-day workshop where I will be posting a video with some information about sensory processing. So it's like a tutorial type of lesson in the morning. And then I'll be setting everyone a really short, simple task to do. And the tasks build every day. So within the 5 days, I give you specific tasks that will then ultimately kind of work you through the process of starting to understand your child's sensory processing in more detail. And then each day for the 5 days at 8 o'clock-ish on an evening, I'll be doing live Q&As for 5 days in a row. So we will have the opportunity to explore things in a bit more detail. So for everyone's more than welcome to come along and join that workshop next week as well. We'll start tomorrow.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Vicki. I've just popped the link there in the chat to the free workshop right there. Sensory Solutions. Yeah. So if you click on that, you can register. And earlier on in the chat, I put the link to the Facebook group as well. Trying to find it again now. So it was here at the top. I'll repost it again at the bottom. I can find it. Here it is. Facebook group. Yeah. I'll just repost that again at the bottom so that everyone can see. There we go.
Brilliant, thank you.
There it is. And yeah, I think it is a tricky one, isn't it? Because obviously we all know about the sort of budget cuts and everything in the government and local council budgets, etc. And I think OT is a really sought after service, and there's often quite long wait lists when parents raise these kind of issues with school. Sometimes a referral is made to OT and then months go by and they're not really sure who to contact, where to go with their concerns. So I think that's really useful resource, your Facebook page. People can join the group and there's regular postings with, you know, people asking for advice and stuff. So yeah, I'm a member and it's really good. So there, personal endorsement. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, Vicki. That was really helpful. Really quick whistle stop tour through all the different senses and things. And thank you very much for answering our questions. And yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch and we'll hear from you again soon, hopefully.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me and everyone giving up their evening, an hour there to come and listen to me talk. It was lovely to virtually meet you all.
Yes, thank you so much. Right, I'm going to stop the recording now and everyone's free to go. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.